Hello everybody, Maven here, and I don't care what you have to say, the Choir of One is the new best weapon in the game. I've used this thing for one day and already put around 3,000 kills on it, and in that time I learned just how broken it is. Now if you don't believe me, I'll preface by saying this. I never tell you guys to stay for the whole video because you're adults, you can make your own decisions, and you can click off the video anytime you like. But this time, I'm gonna tell you to stick around because I did some testing and I want to show you my findings and show you how ridiculous this thing is compared to everything else. Now, first off, if you don't have this thing, a shameless plug, but yesterday I did a guide video on how to get it, and I'll link it in the card in the top right corner, and I'll link it in the description, and I'll link it in the pinned comment. Now, as you can see in the background gameplay, I'm using the Choir of One along with the Gyrfalcon's Hauberk to take advantage of volatile rounds. And if you're a regular viewer of the channel, you've known that in recent months I've highly praised the Buried Bloodline with the Gyrfalcon's Hauberk. It has picture-perfect synergy with the Gyrfalcon's Hauberk and tears through everything. It's a workhorse, and it's extremely reliable in the toughest of content. And I swear, I never thought that anything could ever come close to topping the Buried Bloodline, but Bungie proved me wrong. There's a new kid in town, and his name is Choir, so let me introduce him to you. Hope you enjoy. So let's take a look at the Choir of One. It has the perk Fanatical Lance, which basically just more or less says it has a radial area transposer origin trait. And in addition to that, for lack of a better term, hip firing will give you a wyvern attack. And the retrofit you can unlock this week is Subsistence retrofit, which I would personally argue is the best one. Not too hyped about destabilizing rounds and onslaught, to be honest. So let's waste no time and hop right into some damage testing. So the first thing I wanted to test out is if 5 ADS shots do the same amount of damage as a hipfire wyvern shot, because that shoots a spread of 5 bullets and consumes 5 ammo. And if you ADS a Carl, you get 7,642 damage, so if you multiply that by 5, you get 38,210. But if you hipfire at Carl, you get 29,205 plus 6,177, and when you add that together, it equals 35,382. So you do lose a bit of damage per ammo usage if you hipfire, but as a trade-off, you get massively increased DPS. So I would say the trade-off is worth it, because as you can see here, the wyvern spread comes out very fast and does some pretty massive burst damage, shredding Carl in just 3 mags, and not wasting too much ammo. And comparing that to the Buried Bloodline, yeah, it's not really a comparison, and believe me, the Buried Bloodline is insane compared to a lot of other special and even a lot of heavies. But the Choir just puts it to shame. Now, how does the Choir's total damage output over its reserves compared to the Buried Bloodline? Well, the Choir of One does 12,212 damage to the crit and 7,642 to the body, so over its base 250 reserves, we get 3,053,000 crit damage total and 1,910,000 body shot total. Now with the Buried Bloodline, we do 19,076 to the crit and 16,820 to the body. And over its 70 base reserves, we get 1.335 million crit damage and 1.177 million body shot damage. So the Choir of One is already miles upon miles ahead of the Buried Bloodline in total damage output. It may not have the same range, but it still has really good range. And it may not generate its own Devour upon getting 4 kills, but you're on Void, so you got Echo Starvation to get Devour for you. The only real leverage that the Buried Bloodline has is the weaken on every hit, which is insane, and also synergizes with Echo of Harvest to make a ton of orbs. That's all the Buried Bloodline has to its name right now. Now, I would say the biggest downside of the Choir of One is its ammo economy, which is pretty awful, but thankfully running 2 reserve mods puts it in a good spot, raising its reserves from 250 to 355, a massive difference. But then the downside of that means you can't run resist mods. So just to be fair, let's calculate 2 reserves for the Buried Bloodline 2, which raises your ammo cap from 70 to 80. So with double reserve mods, that brings the Buried Bloodline's total crit damage to 1.526 million and its total body shot damage to 1.345 million. It's still miles behind the Choir of One with no reserves, but now let's calculate the Choir with reserves, which brings its crit damage total up to 4.335 million and its body shot total up to 2.712 million, which is just absolutely mind-blowingly insane for a special weapon. So much so that its body shot total is nearly double of the Buried Bloodline's crit total. Now, a YouTuber I tend to reference every now and then is Ninji. You should definitely go and check him out if you're a fan of weapons DPS tested against bosses, because that's what he does. And he streams on Twitch as well. And in his recent Choir of One video, he he was able to 2-bell Keitel, which is very impressive compared to a lot of things. There's not many special weapons in the game that have the honors of that accomplishment. And in his Buried Bloodline video, he went through all 3 bells, and Keitel still had about a third of her health remaining. Now, is this me saying that the Buried Bloodline ain't broken? No, not at all. It's still one of the most broken special weapons in the game. It's better than rocket-assisted sidearms and heavy machine guns, probably combined. But what I'm saying is that the Choir of One is just even more broken. Now, with this Gyrfalcon's Hauberk build, we can build into the Choir of One with our mod setup. We're running double reserves with this Surge and a copy of Time Dilation. And we even have the Infinite Special setup, which is basically just a copy of Charged Up on the chest, stacks on the boots, and Special Finisher on your class item. Having this 3 mod setup makes it free as heck to be able to spam Special Finisher wherever you see fit, so you can just use your Choir of One as a primary. So the idea is that we emerge from Invis and get those volatile rounds with the Gyrfalcons, and then we weaken with an undermining grenade or a snare bomb, and then we have our Surge going, and then we just blow our load with the Wyvern hipfire shot and absolutely demolish whatever is in front of us. So here is what that looks like against Carl. Emerge with a smoke, hipfire, dodge, hipfire, and he gets deleted in about 2 seconds. And to put into perspective of how big that is, we're going to compare that against the Cold Comfort rocket launcher. It's an adaptive frame, which is the highest damaging archetype. And we got Restoration Ritual and Envious Assassin, meaning we can shoot off 4 rockets without having to reload. Now, I may not have proc bait and switch in this clip, but still, comparing against the base damage of an adaptive rocket launcher is a fine enough comparison for a special weapon. And our volley of 4 rockets did not even kill Carl, and it also took half of our reserves, by the way. So the fact that our Choir of One shredded him in 2 seconds is incredibly overpowered. And it's not like I'm showing anything that's a stretch. I'm not showing anything far-fetched or ambitious, because this is literally the Gyrfalcon's build. This is literally what we can do anywhere, anytime. We just got a nuke with infinite ammo, mind you, that we can use non-stop everywhere. Now let's move on to another comparison. So I did the solo expert lost sector, which was Exodus Garden 2A this day. I did it with the Reigning King, the Buried Bloodline, and I did it with the Choir of One. I wanted to see which one made it the easiest, and I'd be lying if I didn't say it wasn't a walk in the park with the Buried Bloodline. This thing still makes hard content into a cakewalk. You can't go wrong. It is a powerhouse. It will shred through most things, but it won't shred through champions and bosses to a degree where I wouldn't pull out my heavy. Of course, I'm going to pull out that bait and switch edge transit and go to town on those tankier targets, because that's the more optimal thing to do. But in this gameplay, you can still see me taking down overload champions with just my Buried Bloodline, and it does a fine job at an expert level. But anything beyond this, I would definitely need to pull out my heavy, especially in a Grandmaster. Like I said though, the Buried Bloodline makes Devour much more consistent, because sometimes we'll be at long range with no current means to get an Orb of Power or a Void Breach, so we can just get it by getting 4 kills. Also, it's a team support weapon because it applies that weaken to every target. So that's a 15% damage bonus for 3 players. So that's kind of like a 45% damage buff if you think about it. But even if you theorize that it did 45% more damage, it still doesn't surpass the Choir's DPS, overall damage output, or ammo economy at double reserves. Another issue about the Buried Bloodline, and the biggest issue I see people say about it in my comment section, is that they just don't have it. It is a random drop from the Warlord's Ruin boss, and a lot of people have been unlucky in their efforts. But the Choir of One is something you can pretty much get in a half hour from right now if you wanted it. But anyways, you get the idea. The Buried Bloodline put in the work in this lost sector, and now let's do it again with the Choir of One so you can see the comparison. Now remember how I just said that if I stun a champion while using the Buried Bloodline, I'd still have to pull out my edge transit to finish them off because it would just do a bit more damage than the Bloodline does? Well, that's not an issue for the Choir of One. As a matter of fact, pulling out your GL is a bad idea when you use this thing, because the Choir does better burst damage, so it feels like the GL actually nerfs you. You either saw it or will see it in the background gameplay, but when I came up to the barrier champion, I didn't even bother stunning it, because the Choir of One absolutely obliterated that thing in 1 second. That's something that the Buried Bloodline couldn't do in its wildest dreams. If I used my edge transit, that champion may have had a chance to put up its barrier, but with this dumb auto rifle, nope, it just gets gets deleted. And you know what? It didn't even cost me any ammo because this thing is basically a primary, because with our mod setup, we have infinite special ammo finishers at our disposal. And the ad clear is extremely ammo efficient in that semi-auto mode when you basically use it like a scout rifle. Has good range, easily picks off any trash mobs in the game in 1 to 2 shots. Not to mention, we're making those radial area pools, basically setting up spawn traps in areas that ads are constantly spawning out of. I will say it did take more shots than anticipated to stun the overloads, but that's not a serious issue. And typically servitors are some of the tankiest common mobs in the entire game, but the Choir of One preys on these big body targets. It just makes it that much easier to land your hipfire wyvern shots. Speaking of which, when we come up to the final boss of the Lost Sector, which just so happens to be a servitor as well, you can see what I mean, just gets roasted. Now I will say this, as amazing as the Buried Bloodline is and how much I've used it, it doesn't feel fun to use, and its stability is pretty bad, making it feel worse. On the other hand, the Choir feels incredibly fun to use. It performed better, faster, it was more stable, more versatile, and much more fun. So I decided to put the Choir of One to the Grandmaster test next, which was Heist Battlegrounds Europa this week. And I don't really have too much highlights because there was a lot of team shots and my teammates were kind of stealing the thunder. But in the boss room, we were just chilling in the typical cheese spot. And on the right side, witches or knights will spawn and will typically ruin you if you don't have heavy or wish ender ready for them. But the Choir of One made it absolutely free to take them out. If there was a chunky enemy in my face, I can just invis, get as close as I can, dump that wyvern load, and schmelt them. It's not a problem at all. It's so versatile and solves problems that no other special weapon can do. In a variety of situations, it's amazing, to put it simply. And remember that when you're not at the range to hip fire at the boss, you can still ADS and get even better total damage output. It's just that the DPS will be lesser, but it doesn't mean that it still can't get the job done. So it's a workhorse and a half, and it gets my stamp of approval for Grandmaster Nightfalls. But I did want to do one final test. The Legend 50 Wave Onslaught test, but I guess it's called Expert Onslaught now. So 50 Wave Expert Onslaught is unarguably among the toughest challenges in Destiny 2 history. It's definitely up there. It's one of them. And in this scenario, it should have been tougher than usual for me because not only have I not done this activity in months, but I also queued with random blueberries I found on the in-game LFG tab. So this should have been borderline impossible, but lucky for me, I had leverage, the Choir of One. Now there are really not many weapons that you can succeed with in waves 30 through 50 of Expert Onslaught because the difficulty will just about exceed Grandmasters. I did this same test back in the day with Buried Bloodline and it passed the test with flying colors. So you know what that means. If the Buried Bloodline passed the Onslaught test, Choir of One annihilated the Onslaught test. And don't get me wrong, I have done a few 50 Wave Expert Onslaught runs with Buried Bloodline back in the Hall of Champions days. And what I learned from those runs is that with the Buried Bloodline is that it actually starts to feel weak in later waves, not gonna lie. Those yellow bars actually tanked my shots pretty well. And another thing I learned is that I had to be very mindful of my ammo with the Buried Bloodline and had to attempt special ammo finishers much more frequently because I actually found myself running out of ammo here and there. On the other hand, with the Choir of One, how many times did I run out of ammo in all 50 waves? None. That's right, not a single time. And I didn't even have to stress about it either. I performed finishers here and there when I had the chance, but overall, I didn't have to sweat it nearly as much as I did with the Buried Bloodline. But did the gun start to feel weak against the yellow bars in later waves? Nope, not at all. Didn't matter what wave or what enemy or what champion, the Choir of One ripped through everything like a hot knife through butter. I didn't even need a debuff, I just simply had my Surge mod and that's it. No Radiant, no Weaken, no Heavy, didn't matter. I barely even used my Heavy because this thing's basically a Heavy. This gun deletes everything and has infinite ammo. It's absolutely broken and overpowered with the Gyrfalcon's Hauberk builds, but I hope and pray that Bungie doesn't nerf it. Amen. So needless to say, it also passed the 50 Wave Expert Onslaught test with flying colors. First try, by the way. It was one of the easiest 50 Wave runs I've ever done despite having random blueberries and not having done this in months. And I just wanted to show the end screen where I broke over 1,000 kills. So that basically wraps up the video and explains why I said the Choir of One is the new best weapon in the game. Now, is it the best weapon in the game? Not technically, because if we talked about raid boss DPS and I told you the Choir of One was better than Whisper of the Worm, that would be a lie. There is a quote-unquote best gun for everything in Destiny. There are a few best guns, and the Choir of One is just the new best gun on the block. If I'm wrong, which I'm not, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. Feel free to discuss. But if there are any cons to point out about the Choir of One, I would say that it feels like the ADS hit scan bullet still counts as a projectile rather than a bullet, and therefore counts as somewhat of a detonation. I could be wrong, but if that is the case, how is that a problem? Well, it feels like it sometimes eats your volatile rounds. It's kind of hard to explain, but sometimes just fails to chain invis with Stylish Executioner, then you gotta wait for your dodge again. It's a minor annoyance and it doesn't happen often, but it does happen, so I just wanted to point that out. But anyways, that's gonna do it for the video. As always, I will leave a dim loadout link to the build used in this video down below in the description, and if you enjoyed, be sure to drop a like and a comment because your interaction on the video goes a long way and really helps out the algorithm. And if you are new here, please consider subscribing. Would love to have you here. And with that, I'll catch you in the next video. See you later.